in my files that would make for a better background than my cluttered room. And if you'll notice, they're all social distancing.
That's right. That's right.
It's been the lean years of Yankee Stadium.
I think it was a Tuesday night game, if I remember right, and it would have probably been about 4 or 5 years ago, I guess.
I'll just be in front of all my autographed pictures of Hall of Famers. How about
that? There you go.
All right, I think we're live now. I'm just gonna go check
We've been live for a few minutes.
Check the group.
Let's see. We ramble about baseball.
Hey, that's important stuff.
At least on your page. And yes, we are on for a few minutes.
Yeah. All right. Good. We're good to go. So why don't y'all introduce yourselves? We'll go in alphabetical order. So Paul, why don't you go first?
Sure. Yeah, my name is obviously Paul Hammonds. I've been preaching for the Kimberly Church of Christ for a little over a year now, which is the extent of my full-time preaching career. Before that, I had been in digital marketing for the past few years, and so that's really one of the reasons why I was on here, to talk a little bit about some of those principles. And unlike Terry, I haven't had the time. What's that? Sure. Oh, sorry about that. Hold on. Sorry about that. Y'all okay? Y'all look shocked. No, I was just going to share out the feed on my deal, and I forgot to mute it, so I just started talking, and that freaked myself out. You can tell I'm the digital marketing expert because I don't know how to work Facebook.
Especially with social media, yeah.
That's right.
Social media is I just get lost. Yeah, as Perry said, speaking in tongues is not allowed with an interpreter. We just started doing that. So I've been preaching for about really off and on for probably the last 10 or 15 years, but this is the first time that I've actually been doing it full time. So, the reason I'm even here at all is some of that experience I have in the digital marketing side and trying to think about how that applies to the work of an evangelist and the work of the local church and what we can do and use those principles here.
Well, I'm Terry Francis, and I currently work with the Chelsea Church of Christ in Chelsea, Alabama. Paul and I are a little bit distant neighbors now. Mm-hmm. Been here for 2 years. Prior to this, I've spent most of my time in Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, for 10 years with the New Hope Church in Fairview, the Hillview Church over in West Nashville, and 11 years with the East Shelby Church down in Collierville, Tennessee, which is just outside of Memphis. Been preaching about 22 years. Evangelism and marketing are kind of two things that go hand in hand that we often don't realize, and they're things that I really kind of nerd out on a little bit. Paul and I talked a little bit about it yesterday, how I kind of dabbled into that and accidentally fell into some of that stuff. But I think it's important concepts for local churches that are often overlooked. You bring up things like marketing, and I've been told before, we don't need to do that. We got the truth. And I hope to change your opinion about that today, if that's how you think, because that's just not how things work today. So looking forward to this discussion and our discussion at 2:00. I think the same panelists then about rebranding, which is probably even more nerdy for me and Paul. But anyway, it's kind of where I'm at.
Awesome. So let's dive into the topic this morning, which is reaching established people. And let's kind of define what we mean by established. We talked about that a little bit ago. So what is an established person? How would you define that?
Well, according to the definition we just found out 30 seconds ago, an established person is what we're really talking about right now is established in the community, long-term residents that have been here for a while. I moved into an area, it's the fastest growing city in the state of Alabama, but at the same time, it's an interesting suburb of Birmingham. We're about 30 minutes away, but there's a very noticeable rift right now between us new people and the old people in town. And I would just use that as an explanation that the old people in town are what we're talking about by established people. There are houses here selling 5 to 6 days. They're building houses all the time because this is the next affordable place for especially younger families with kids to live on this side of town. 280 corridor is really popular. So that's kind of where I'm at. And with that, we live in a town that's the fastest growing city in the state of Alabama, and none of its railroad crossings have arms on them except for one, and there are about 6 or 7. In fact, the railroad crossing in front of City Hall does not have an arm on it. So let that sink in for a moment. The busiest intersection, which just is an explanation, if you don't realize what I'm saying, about how little the community has grown with its growth pattern. And if you were to tune into our Facebook page, you would see complaints all the time about these new people changing everything. And why can't things just go back the way they are? Well, those people posting that stuff are what we're talking about with established people.
Mm-hmm.
They already go to church somewhere here. They already have lived here. They know more about here than I do. And they also, I think one of the interesting things that tie to this is the idea that every story that the community knows about the church I work with, they know. In fact, they know more stories than what I know about this church. Mm-hmm. And that can either have a good flavor left in their mouth, if you will, or it could be something that's very disgusting to them. And we, especially as evangelists, we move in and we inherit all of that baggage, good or bad. And so from a community aspect, we think about that. That's one area of established people. And I think that's kind of where our main focus is supposed to be today. How do we reach out to them, and how do we maybe change the view they may or may not have about us? How do we alter that, and how do we do that in a way that's not offensive? So that's my understanding. Does that sum that up, Stephen? Probably where you wanted us to go. Paul, you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I think that's good. I would probably add as well, if you look at it in terms of the establishment in our existing member base, I think there's some of the similar ideas there. The difference being that they know who we are. They may be attending with us, but they're used to doing things a certain way. They're kind of comfortable in how they're doing those things, and getting them to try something new often can sound a lot like apostasy, obviously. And sometimes it is. But I think the idea of trying to figure out how to mobilize those people, the more I think about the role of an evangelist, obviously being relatively new to it on a full-time basis, what I read about Paul talking to Timothy and Titus about over and over is the idea of equipping the saints.
Correct.
And I'm not so sure that's not our primary role, is to make sure that the people that we are working with and worshiping with and being in fellowship with on a daily basis are prepared to go out into the community and do those things. And that's really not how we've traditionally thought about the membership roles in the local church. We pay an evangelist to come in and preach for us and to go out and evangelize and door knock and other these things. And I think as you look at the scripture, that's really not the model of how that always works, and certainly not the model of the churches that show the most growth and the most success in the book of Acts and some of the other areas as well. It's members who are equipped and going out and making impacts on people that they see every day. So I think that's to that point. I think there's a couple of ways in which we're trying to get to established people and change their behavior, change their impressions, change their ideas about certain things.
Well, and let me add to that. I think you're absolutely right. Our job is to really teach people how to do evangelism more than just do it all ourselves. And some of you know I'm involved with Phil Martin in a weekly broadcast called Do the Work. And in that, we had Andy Cantrell on one time. And that's one of the things Andy talked about in his growth of that area, is there was a time where he just did it all himself. There comes a point as an evangelist that you're going to reach a breaking point where you can't do that anymore. It just becomes too much. And he realized there had to be a change. He talked about how that his job primarily had to be to equip the members to do that work. And if you look at Ephesians, that's exactly what it says there, that it's the apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors or elders, teachers' job to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. That's our primary focus. And if you even look at 1 Corinthians, it's interesting that Paul, we think about, well, wait a minute, Paul was this evangelist that went about converting everybody, but he says in 1 Corinthians, I'm glad I didn't baptize that many of you. Like there's this impression that he leaves that what he really did was teach other people how to teach other people in that process. And so you're right, from a scriptural pattern, that's our job. So then when you think about this and our assignment today, like what is how do we do that? And I think what's really interesting about this assignment is that if you want to be successful in reaching established people, and you're a guy like me or Paul that's only been there like a year or two, the only way you're going to reach established people is by teaching and equipping your members to reach those established people. Because in the areas like we're in the South, okay? So one of the things about, we're both in Alabama. So like one of the things about Alabama is they are religious, but they're so religious that there's all these preconceived notions about every group with every name.
Yeah.
And so if I go in and I'm like the Church of Christ preacher, and this guy goes to another group down the road, he has a preconceived idea about that. But if I can send Scott that he grew up with to that guy, and Scott, he finds out Scott goes to church in the Church of Christ. Well, he trusts Scott. He doesn't know me from Adam, but he knows Scott. So my job is to equip Scott to reach out and to help Scott along the way. And when the time comes, that may mean include me sitting down and being the co-teacher with Scott, maybe even the main teacher. But the idea of connecting to the established person in your most successful way, especially to established people, is using established community members within your church to reach out to the established community members outside of your church. That's the most effective way to make that happen.
Yeah. And to go along with that, the difference between someone who is established and someone who is not established is someone who is not established, the one who is coming to you, he's seeking something. He has a need. That's the gospel pattern. People come to the gospel because they see something that it offers that they do not have. Established people don't feel that way. They have it. They're there. If you're in Chick-fil-A doing a study, which I love the idea of that. I haven't seen it work a lot, but I love the concept of it. But people are coming by. Oh, you guys studying the Bible? Yeah, that's right. Oh, that's so great. Good. God bless you. That's fantastic. Well, you want to join us? Oh, I'm good. And they'll move on because I know I don't need to study. This is for those other people. And when you're in the Bible Belt, I lived in New Jersey for about 6 years before I came down here. And in talking to guys like Ben Hall and Caleb and some of the guys that are working in that area in Brooklyn and New York, they can't get enough Bible studies. They're getting studies all the time. Now they may not go anywhere, but those are people that are not established. They're looking for answers. They know that they don't know a lot of stuff. And one of the ideas about going to established people is converting their mindset to thinking that they don't know. There's something that they are missing. And the only way to do that is to find some way to get in front of them and have discussions with them to bring those things up. Because, we'll talk about this from a digital marketing standpoint. They're not going out looking for my website to figure out who I am and what I can do for them or things like that. They're not going out looking for me. And from a digital standpoint, the only way that you either have to find people that are looking for you and be where they're going to go, or you have to come and get them and bring them there. And the established people, it's all about coming and getting them.
Yeah, it's a different approach than we talked about last week, where somebody's going to Google like churches in Nashville. Somebody who's lived in Nashville for 50 years, they're not doing that. Right? Yeah, you're exactly right. So how do you do that?
Well, I mean, I still say the number one way you do that is just by getting your folks to be good folks and getting them to be, well, let me say this. I think part of that is, this is going to sound really kind of judgmental, not meant to be. We're not as spiritually minded as we think we are. And what I mean by that is, we could talk to people about sports. We could talk to people about the weather, about politics, about the coronavirus, about whether we should wear masks or not. Like, we could talk about all that stuff. But when it comes to talking about spiritual things, and especially within the context of relationships, we're not good at that. And so one of the things we've got to train our people to do, and I'm watching the Facebook feed, so I see Stoneheart brought up relationships, and that's really what I'm saying. That is the number one way. But you've got to teach your members to be more spiritually minded in their relationships outside of the church building, so that they begin to be spiritual people with people they don't go to church with. Like, so they begin, and we've got to train them a little bit on, and that doesn't mean that you go in their face and go, have you been baptized in the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost? If not, you're going to hell. We need to talk about that. Like, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is seeing those openings to bring up spiritual things. And we're talking about talking about church, oh man, we're in a study right now. You should really love it. You should come join us in that. Or the preacher preached this lesson, and that creeps into the social media. Paul and I were talking yesterday on the phone prepping for today. And I said, one of our problems is, I've got members, they'll share every meme on the planet about politics, but they don't share the sermon from last Sunday. And you're like, come on, guys. It's easy. It's a couple of clicks of a button, is all it is. And it's like so many other things, if you look into marketing, it's not always that one advertising campaign is the key. It's the fact that the repetition of good advertising campaigns is what gets people's attention. It may not be till the 30th video you share on Facebook that one of the established community members actually watches it. But you got to share it 30 times to try to get them to do that, and so we're just not very spiritual. We can share everything on Facebook for everything else. I live in Alabama. I'm just going to tell you, we got members that'll post 10 things in a 2.5-hour Alabama football game on their Facebook page, right?
Yeah.
But there's not 10 posts about things at church on their Facebook page in a year. So it's easy. I think it's easier than we think it is, but it's harder to get people to think that way. So from that standpoint, I just don't think we're very spiritually minded. We're not very conscious about that. So the first thing we really got to train people to do is to realize their relationships are our greatest advantage. And I tell you where in Memphis, we had the greatest success with that real quick is with teenagers. Our teenagers were great at bringing people to church, and we converted young people who were still faithful. Our teens were better than our adults at that. It was amazing to see that. And we just got to get people to think more along those ways.
So we have a comment from Perry, and he said, dealing with the pandemic now, it's easy to work in this conversation if your church is doing Zoom services. Since everyone knows about Zoom now, you can invite them to your Zoom feed. So I thought that was a good comment. What were you going to say, Paul?
What was I going to say? I think that, and I've always been one of the worst offenders about this. And I don't know that I know the answer to this, and maybe this would be a great topic for a discussion, would be how to get us to talk about spiritual things more. Because I don't think that the problem is that we're not interested. I think there's a lot of people that are passionate about the word, that are passionate about the Bible, but for whatever reason, when we get out in the parking lot afterwards and talk about it, that's not what we talk about. And I'm not sure whether it's just a habit that is so deeply ingrained with us, or it's something that it just doesn't occur to us, or we're just not sure the best way to start that conversation. But to Terry's point, yeah, we think of ourselves as spiritual, but we don't talk about spiritual things that often. And at the end of the day, when we talk about marketing and we talk about branding and all of those things, and to Keith's point, the idea that it is about relationships is exactly right. And I think Terry alluded to this earlier, that when we start talking about marketing and people, well, that's just a gimmick or whatever. And to be very clear that at the end of the day, the relationship is what matters. The establishing that relationship is what's going to bring somebody to Christ. It's not going to be that we had a great logo. Those are just simply things to stimulate conversation, to draw attention to something, to find somebody that may be looking for something, and talking to them in a language that they will understand, and that they will register as something to respond to. But at the end of the day, we have to be spiritual people that love each other, that are showing Christ in our lives. And that's what people will see about us. And that's more important, obviously, than any marketing campaign that you're going to do.
Yeah, sure.
So there's a couple things, and y'all can talk about either one of them, regarding marketing. Like, there might be some pushback maybe to that word. And but the Apostle Paul will say over in 2 Corinthians, therefore, knowing the fear of the Lord, we persuade people. And so maybe if y'all want to talk about this idea of with how it applies to an established population or really to anybody. How do you persuade people? And then maybe y'all know the number. I don't know the number, but billboards. Like to me, it's like they're a giant waste of money because I've never been driving down the highway and seen a billboard and go, "Oh, I need to pull over so I can write that phone number down." Right? But
Yeah.
so that billboard exists not because they think you're going to write their phone number down, but because as you drive by it 100, 1,000 times, you're seeing that name, that company, that logo, whatever, over and over and over, and you're being exposed to it. And so, how does that kind of, I think y'all have touched on both of those things a little bit in the discussion so far. So, how do you use those ideas maybe to work with getting a congregation motivated to go reach people?
Well,
This is where you're requiring us to have answers, and I'm not. This is where we're going to start drawing blanks.
And that's okay.
well, yeah. To the billboards, let me say, billboards are all about. It's just another layer of brand recognition. Is really all it is. So, it's when you think about the brands you know the most, whether it's the State Farm logo or FedEx or Coca-Cola or any of those things. The reason that those things pop out to you is just because you have been inundated with them so much in life. To even where their color combinations and their fonts, you don't realize this, but that becomes a part of the brand recognition. If you see red and yellow together, whether you realize it or not, you're going to probably like a 65% chance think of McDonald's because that's their colors. And it's unique to them. So from that standpoint, a billboard is the same thing. In Alabama, the big joke is there's a lawyer called Alexander Shannara, whose tagline is "Call me Alabama." And I know Paul's heard that. I mean, but the guy has billboards like every mile of every interstate. And the whole point of that is, and he's got commercials on radio and on TV. All of that goes together with this just huge campaign this guy has, who's basically an ambulance chaser, that if you get in a bad wreck or if you get in trouble with Social Security, you're going to call Alexander Shannara because you've seen that stuff all the time. And so that's all a billboard is. The problem with billboards for churches, for it to really be effective, you got to tie it in to a massive marketing campaign where it's got to be one of several images you see for it to be effective. So if you were to do a billboard and then support it with mail outs and Facebook advertisements, I would say newspaper, but that's a dead industry. You're not doing that anymore. Although with established people, they're the older establishments, most likely to still get the newspaper. If there's a local weekly newspaper in your town, that's what they're reading every week, but as a general rule. So the problem with the billboard is, to get back to that, it's really expensive. I think the artwork alone is a couple thousand, somewhere between $2,000 to $5,000. You're talking about at least $1,500 usually a month on top of that. Now, the new digital billboards with the changing images, those are actually, I think, more effective at catching your eye. I've not checked into prices. It's been a long time since I checked in pricing, but just as a general rule, that kind of stuff is really expensive, and for most of us, it's just not a good use of your funds. You can be more successful in marketing doing other things. So
let's move from like the traditional billboard to the new, we can coin a phrase here, the new billboard, the neo billboard, which is Facebook. Right?
Yeah.
Facebook feeds, Facebook ads. So how do you, I think you touched on part of it already, is you've got to get people in the church to post about spiritual stuff.
Yeah.
And the more that happens, then the people in the local church will be recognized as spiritual people. So how do you do, what are some ideas like with maybe Facebook ads or maybe ways you could get a local church to post something consistent? What do you do with that?
That's something we're working on here. Is you've got to have better content and more content. We're not at that level yet, but you really need like daily content. You need, and so more than just your 30-minute sermon, because that's the last thing anybody wants to watch is me talk for 30 minutes. regardless of how good the message is.
Right.
So some daily thoughts, some 2-minute videos here and there, and not just of me, but of members, some verses with a good graphic, anything like that somebody can share and post on their timeline that connects them, throws them back to your page, is really the best way. We have played around with advertising on Facebook, and when you do that, you'll find out there's a sweet spot for that, because Facebook's really good about giving you a report back about who's looking and that kind of stuff. So whenever I do a Facebook boost now, I limit that in the programming of it. The demographic that is most successful on Facebook is 35 to 44 years old. Within that, you're going to be roughly 2/3 female versus 1/3 male. And you're going to be somewhere around 90 to 95% mobile devices versus desktop PC interaction. So that's been consistent across the board. So I started off with boosting to a broader age range. And the last time I boosted, I only boosted to 35 to 44-year-old people. I limited it to that. I limited it to mobile devices because you just want to get the most bang for your buck when you're spending that money. And it may be different where you're at, but you can also restrict that geographically. You can go like 15 miles from your location. So there's a lot of things you can do within that. But again, that's just kind of like broadcast seeding is what you're doing, to kind of reference the parable of the soils. You're just throwing seed everywhere. Whereas if I can get my members to share those same things, then it's connected relationships that go, oh, well, wait a minute. If Scott thinks this is good, maybe it is good. And that's completely free. And I see Perry's been doing these 2-minute videos, and he's been sharing those a lot. And I think they're great, the 2-minute videos. I'll tell you one thing I learned. I'll turn back over to Paul from a couple of years ago. I had a good friend who worked for PR for Disney Imagineering. So part of his job was, which is really cool, was public relations for Disney when they were coming out with rides. And he worked with the Imagineers and all of those kind of things. And he told me years ago that Disney's most successful form of marketing was just raw, untouched 2-minute videos that they posted on their blog. Millions of people. Now, part of that was that it's Disney. People eat up Disney. It's okay. We all know that. But the other side of that is a lot of times we overproduce our stuff, and we want to put like PowerPoint and graphics and all this kind of stuff. And that's fine if you want to do that. I will tell you, to some degree, it's not the best use of your time, because even if you do it with no graphics and just a raw, uncut video, people are just as likely to watch it. And it's a lot less time. So that's my one kind of plug about the video. I do think everybody's going to video. People don't want to read. Paul and I talked about that yesterday. If you log on to your webpage and it's a ton of text, I just want you to know nobody's reading that. They're just not. And as Paul talked about, and he understands this side more, and I'm sure next week if he joins, he'll talk about this. You got to have text in order to drive your Google placement up. Like, it's a requirement. You just got to be wise about what you do, because people would rather watch a 2-minute video than read 450 words. It's just the culture we live in.
And maybe with
and
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Stephen.
No, go
ahead.
I
was going to say, I think that I haven't done the research on a lot of things we're doing now in terms of the videos and even the 2-minute videos. I do know that, typically speaking, if you can get anybody to watch a video on Facebook for more than 30 seconds, you're doing pretty well. It gets back to the idea of what do you want to accomplish, who are you trying to talk to, and having a plan. And this is my problem, because right now with the small group, I'm kind of doing a lot of this all on my own. And so basically I have to, a lot of it is impulse of what do I feel motivated to do today. And that's not a good way to do do marketing efforts. You have to have a strategy. You need to be thinking conscientiously about who I'm trying to talk to right now. The broader your marketing campaign, this is where billboards have one purpose and one purpose only, is to tell people that you are there. That's all they're going to accomplish. Because the reality is that 99% of the people that see your billboard either will not come, or when they come to worship you, they are not going to be interested in what you're doing, because it's not what they're looking for. So finding ways to figure out, how can I get people to tell me what they're looking for? How can I get people to be involved and to actually contact me with questions, with ideas that they have? And the only way to do that is to establish yourself as visible, as available, and as authoritative in certain ways, and being able to answer questions, and making sure that people know that you're available to answer questions. And that's a long process. And it requires a lot of, I just one time posted, hey, what kind of sermon what would you like to hear about? What would be a useful thing? And I think those are good things to do, but you got to do them regularly. They've got to be there all the time. In fact, it's not a bad idea to get your members to actually start spoon feeding you questions, and getting them engaged. And I think this is where the idea of how social media works is not always apparent to our members. And it's worth talking to them about, and I haven't had this conversation and I need to, but the idea that Facebook typically will show you about 10% of the posts or less of people that are posting that pretty good chance if I post something, 90% of the people that are following me will never see it. The way that you fix that is to get people to like it, to share it, to interact with it, and do things with it. And because the more that you do that, the more Facebook thinks that what you put out there is valuable. Why would Facebook want anybody to see it if your close friends don't even care about it? And that's where I think I was half joking about the idea the other day about getting a digital amen from somebody watching me stream. And that feels like it's kind of an ego boost. And in a way it is. I mean, when you're streaming video and nobody's responding, you're like, what am I doing here? Does anybody care? Does anybody listening? You can't see anything. And for those of you who may watch this at some point, you're not stroking our egos by clicking a like. If you hear a point that we make, there is an actual real purpose for that. Is to tell Facebook that you think this is valuable. And those are things that help more people to see it, more people to engage in it. And I think getting people to understand how Facebook works, there you go. There's some likes that are coming up right now. People understand how that works. It changes how we interact with Facebook or any kind of social media, and teaches us to be a little bit more strategic about what we do when we're on, whether it be making sure that, I normally don't comment on stuff. We'll comment on something. It doesn't have to be anything meaningful. It doesn't have to be anything substantial. Just say amen or good job or thanks for that or well, I don't agree with that. Whatever it might be, the comment and the share, the like, that is what drives your effectiveness on social media. If you don't have that, you're not going to go anywhere. And so I think that gets back to the idea that we just throw something on social media and then, it didn't do anything, and so we just give up on it. If you don't have a membership that is willing to push that and drive it and be engaged in it, it's not going to work. That's why it's called social.
Yep.
So, that's I think if you want to get your campaign or your social media to have an impact beyond your immediate inner circle, that's really the only way that you can get it to happen.
Yeah, you've almost got to assign your folks to go in every day and look at the church page. Tell them you got to like it every day and you got to share it at least every other day, right? And you need to mix up the post too. So one of the things I think about social media is there always tends to be only one thing that, it's either everybody does 2-minute videos or everybody does scripture versus daily thoughts. You need to mix it up with different things. So one of the things I think is important too is to share photos of things that are real events within your congregation. Purposely have people take pictures or videos of some of the kids' Bible classes, as long as the parents are okay with them being online that way. Maybe you take the back of the kid's head, so it's not a big issue. Take some video of the congregation worshiping or some pictures. Post those. Last week we met for the first time in over 8 weeks, and we did that in our parking lot just because that's what we feel comfortable with. And we posted a whole bunch of pictures, and we posted some video about that. One of the videos was when it started to rain on us, and we still just kept worshiping. And, we posted it out there because all of that stuff, mixing it up, also plays an important role. If I'm your friend and I don't go to church with you, and all you do is post verses from Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes every day, at some point I'm going to hide those posts because I'm tired of seeing them. So you got to have some variety into all that. And I know Stephen replied to Ruth Moore, so I'll tell you about Instagram real quick. Instagram's especially got to be photo-based. And by photo-based, I don't mean scripture verses on pretty graphics. I mean real-life photo-based. Because you're reaching part of what gets into this marketing is understanding the demographics of different generations. One interesting thing about generations is if you call my generation or Paul's generation, you leave us a voicemail, we're going to listen to it. You call anybody under 30 and leave them a voicemail, they are not going to listen to it. I guarantee you 80% of the people under 30, you pick up their phone and there are probably dozens of unlistened to voicemails on their phone. Because if it's important, you will text me. That's what they'll tell you. And that's a generational thing. So Instagram is a generational thing. Facebook starts about 35, and people read from 35 and older. Instagram, I want to look at a video or a quick or a picture, and I want to see it be about you. I don't want it to be some paid-for advertisement looking thing. So here's my suggestion on I'm not on the social media one, at least right now. I'm not. You want to do Instagram? Great. Find a teenager or an early 20-year-old and ask them to run your Instagram account for your church.
Yeah.
It's a great way to get them involved. And you kind of you will have to walk them through what you expect, and you'll have to check it and make sure. But they will be better at using the Instagram account to connect to people than you will be. And that's a powerful thing.
And to make that work, you got to fight your instinct to control it. You got to let them go and be authentic and do it the way they want to do it. None of this is the old joke about a digital marketer who designs a website and goes to his client and says, and they say, well, look, we need to have a better website. Our website is just stale. It's just a picture of two guys and some text, and it's just not working for us. Great. So we want to bring you in. And he says, okay, I'm going to start doing it. And so he starts working on it, and he comes back with it, and they keep saying, well, that's nice, but, we really need this. And they start, and why don't you add that? And by the time they get done, they've got something that's worse than what they had before, because they just put a bunch of stuff on there that has no purpose other than the fact that they just thought it was cool. And ideally, social media only works when it's authentic. When somebody's doing something that speaks to them and it's a reflection of themselves. When you get somebody doing Instagram, you create a champion. That's kind of the idea you think about in marketing, that you get somebody who's going to be a brand champion. And the only way that works is that when they tell their friends what you mean to them, in the language that they use, in the way they say it. That may sometimes mean trusting somebody to make mistakes. Sure. Trusting somebody to say something that may not have been 100% scripturally the exact way that we would have preferred that she say it, or he say it, or whoever it may be. There's some risk involved in that, but people can tell when you're faking it. And that's the quickest way, I think, to lose credibility on social media, when they realize that this is just somebody that's basically just a channel where people are pumping stuff through them and they're just forwarding it on, because people don't care about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do we, this is all great stuff. And now kind of taking it back to established people in the community, because that's really what we want to think about this morning. How do you use this now to reach the established people in the community who have been there for a long time, but maybe haven't really been interested? Is there a way to use, and that includes really people from all age ranges, because there are 15-year-olds in Nashville who have only ever lived in Nashville, and they know where the church that their family goes to is. So how do you start using this to reach those people? And there may not be an answer to this, but is there a specific way to target that kind of person rather than reaching out to people who are moving into a community? Do you have any ideas on that?
So one of the things that I've not done this as much here because I have some ongoing family responsibilities make it more difficult. But in previous works, especially in smaller communities, so a little more difficult, quite frankly, Stephen, in the greater Nashville area where you're at, was more difficult on the west side of Nashville where I was at. But when I was in small communities like I'm in now, and even oddly enough in Collierville, which is very comparable to Brentwood for Memphis, so they're kind of the two equivalencies. Find out where that group of old guys drinks coffee, and ease yourself into that group. That group of old guys in Collierville was always at Starbucks. I dropped kids off at school, and they were at the big table at Starbucks, and they never told anybody they couldn't come. And it started off, I would just sit at the end of that big table, and I would pull a book out or my computer out, and I would drink my coffee next to those guys. And eventually they pulled me into the conversation to where today, 2 years later, I could walk in and some of those guys would call me by name and know me. Now, none of them did I ever get to quote convert, but it was funny. On a regular basis, I'd walk in and say, "Hey, so-and-so, we were telling him to look for you. He's got some family issues, or he's got this, or he needs to talk to a preacher." And so here were these established guys in the community referring me almost like I was their preacher. They went to other churches, but, "Oh, you ought to talk to Terry." So get into those guys. In Fairview, my first work, there was a gas station that had a great little kind of grill area in it. And I ate there 3 days a week because it got me to be in the crowd with all the local people. And so that was another way. So find out where the local people eat and hang out and try to graft yourself into that. But then in Collierville, I learned through the business networking that the greatest ways that you can connect to a community are through churches, schools, and sports. So if you want to really get in with established people, you think in those lines too. All my kids have played sports. My son was a football player. My daughter's a soccer player. My youngest is a manager for the basketball team. Well, every time I'm at those events, as an evangelist, I realize I'm a representative of the Chelsea Church of Christ when I'm there. What I've got to do is I've got to get my other members to realize they're also ambassadors for us in those type of events, and to establish those connections. So it's all about relationships, right? Well, you got to figure out how to make those relationships within the context of your kids' practices, of your kids' performances at school, with your teachers, all of those things. They're ready-made relationships sitting there waiting for you and all your members, and you've got to get them. So I don't know, Stephen, do you have screen share turned on for us? Is that something we can do, or I didn't ask you that earlier?
Well, the problem that we've had with that is every time we try and share the screens, it kills the feed.
Wow. Okay. So we won't try that. When we're meeting on the third Sunday of every month, this is something I picked up from Andy Cantrell, we have an evangelism meeting. And at that evangelism meeting, we hand out cards for the next meeting. And I call it our EAT card. This came from Chris Emerson in Texas. It's an evangelism action tracker. And on that card, it has 2 things for you to fill out. One is 5 evangelistic interactions you've had over the last month. So you would keep that card somewhere. You could write down, I talked to so-and-so at practice, or I talked to this person at Bojangles, or whatever it is. And then the other one we added was 3 guest follow-ups. So something to follow up with our visitors that come, whether you wrote a card or made a call or a visit or had them in your home or something. And the point of that is, so we get together once a month and we go over those cards that we filled out. It may only be 10 of us, but it's 10 people that have these cards that are thinking along these lines, that are going out, and they're coming back and going, "Hey, I had this interaction with so-and-so. We talked about this." Does a couple of things. It allows us as a group to go, "Hey, did you think about handling that this way?" Or it may be that we celebrate the good way they handled it. It also allows us to pray for those different interactions and different contacts, that maybe something more will come from that. But the bigger thing is just talking about that stuff all the time just keeps it on the forefront of your mind. And so part of that training is to try to get your members to come to some environment like that where you're just consistently talking about, here's something we need to do, here's something we need to do, and you're keeping it on the forefront of their mind. And there's a part of you, even me as the evangelist, I'm like, oh man, I've got that evangelism meeting coming up next week, and I've only talked to 2 people. I better turn it on, or I'm going to look like a loser, So I think there's some real value to that kind of interaction where you're actually holding each other accountable for talking to people. And if it's about relationships and using those relationships, this is how we can hold each other accountable to use those relationships in the area of evangelism.
Yeah. Terry mentioned networking earlier. And I think that's one of the things that I've learned. I've been unemployed a few times, and in the job search world, basically what they tell you is, look, you can fill out all the applications you want, and you can send them out to as many employers you want. 99.999% of them will never be read. Or if they are, they'll just be glanced at and thrown away. People don't want to hire that way. The reason they hire is that they know somebody that knows you. It is always about a connection. Terry mentioned the idea that he's got people in the community that will refer him on because he has what you would call share of mind, which means that it's a concept of the idea that brands everywhere want to have a share of your wallet. They want to have a share of your mind. That means that when a subject comes up, you are going to be there. They're going to be thought of. So when I start thinking, when something spiritual does come up, the first thing I'm going to associate that with is Terry. I know him. He's always talking about the Bible, or he's a spiritual guy. He might know the answer to this, and that, it may never pay off, but when it does pay off, it's a big deal because now somebody that trusts that person has said, well, you should go talk to so-and-so. He may be able to help you. And what happens from that is 2 things. On the one hand, you get somebody who's now referred to you by, and this is, by the way, how digital marketing works too. When we talk about websites and how they work and why SEO works, it's because somebody that people trust thinks you're trustworthy. You have to establish that. And what will happen at that point is that person will then come and check you out. And that's where, for example, the idea of the website, the idea of your social media presence and things like that, which you think I'm just wasting my time out there because nobody ever comes to our website. Well, at some point, somebody's going to want to check you out. And they're not going to come to you first. They want to know ahead of time. One of the biggest changes in marketing over the last 10 years or even the last 5 years is that nobody wants to talk to a sales guy until they've done the research. I don't want to have, when I want to know something, I'll come ask you. Otherwise, just leave me alone. That's how we shop now. And so the same thing is true of our worship and our church and what we do. When somebody's a visitor, they're going to go look at, and they are not just a drive-by visitor, but somebody that's actually decided, I'm going to go check them out. I'm going to go to their website. I'm going to look around and see if there's anything weird. If something catches my eye that's interesting, I'm not sure what it is, I'll ask. And it's being ready for those moments. You're trying to have a strategy that is in place to say, when I get that referral, I need to be ready for it because they don't happen very often. I don't want to drop the ball at that point. So I've got to be thinking about that. And that's kind of where to the point earlier about training ourselves to be ready for those moments. What do we do with the visitor when they come in? How do we handle a visitor? Do we just all go up and mob them and ask them 8 million questions? Do we ignore them? Do we shake their hands? How does that work? Because when we have that and we're doing those things together, when we're doing Bible classes in the community or in somebody's home with a purpose, the idea that if somebody comes in, how are we going to approach that? Do we have a plan for somebody that comes in that's just passing through as opposed to somebody who's looking for a church home or whatever it might be? Just thinking through those things and you want to call it a marketing strategy. If you don't want to call it that, that's fine. But something where we're going to be able to give that person what they're looking for. And I think the more you think about that and start to anticipate all the ways in which that can happen. And again, this is one of those things where when you got 4 evangelists on staff and you have the time and the wheelhouse to actually think about those things, it works really well. When you're basically running the whole show, it can be kind of hard to do, which is why you need the members out there actualized and doing all these things themselves.
You bring up the guest receiving what we call guest evangelism. We've called that guest evangelism most places I've been at. We have a specific strategy about how we handle all that.
Yeah.
I mean, down to how many cards get sent and how often they get sent. You only fill out a visitor's card with us one time. We have a team of guys. Their only job is to remember guests, that we receive them, we track them. I hate to tell you that, but we have a printout that tells us who the guests are. I'm on that team. The reason we do that, it's every local guest within the last 6 weeks. And the reason we do that is a lot of times being able to see their name and maybe a short description of their kids or something helps us remember that. So if the second time you come in and me or Brandon walk up to you and go, "Hey, Paul, good to see you again. How you doing?" And it's your second time or third time to be there. Wow. Right. I mean, we all think that. He remembers who I am. And yeah, we cheat about that a little bit. We have a list of who you are, and you're not going to know that because we're not going to pull that list out in front of you. And then, what our job is beyond remembering you is to cultivate those relationships. So, one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to notice different things about you. And I'm going to purposely try to connect you to other people that have those things in common. In Memphis, when I was there, we were right in the corner of Arkansas, Mississippi, and Tennessee. And we had people from all 3 states. If you move there and you live down in South Haven, I'm purposely on your second or third visit going to connect you directly. I'm going to go up and say, "Hey, Paul, here's Todd. He lives down in South Haven, probably not that far from you." And I'm going to walk away. And I'm going to hope that Todd does his job. And now all of a sudden, instead of you just knowing me, now you know Todd. And then the next week, I'm going to find somebody who's in the same field of work that you're in, or drives the same car that you drive, or roots for the same team that you root for. Or if you homeschool, I'm going to connect you to one of our homeschool families. If you go to a public school, I'm going to connect you to a public school family. I'm going to make all of those bridges. And by the time that you visited 5 or 6 times, I hope that you have 5 or 6 connections to different families in the congregation, right? All of that is specifically designed within our guest evangelism strategy to make sure that we're connecting and building these relationships. Because as we said over and over again today, it's all about relationships. And even marketing is about a relationship. Marketing is really about how can I open the door to build a relationship with you that then allows me to sell you something. In our case, it is to teach you the gospel. And that's all marketing is for us, is trying to open that door so I can build that relationship.
And it almost sounds creepy, but when you think about it, because, well, you're just kind of trying to manipulate, you're trying to orchestrate this thing, and I can tell you that the way, for example, that Google thinks about this, when they're finding all your information, they know everything there is to know about you. The strategy for them is not to manipulate you, at least not that I know of. Maybe the tinfoil hat group can correct me on this, but the idea is I want to be able to give you the best experience possible. And the only way I can do that is to know a lot about you and make sure that you're getting what you need out of this experience. And the idea is that, we want to be able to know that this person is going to have a positive experience when they come here in every way that we can control. I can't control it if they get upset about something that we preach or something that we believe. That's, no, I want to make sure everybody understands. We're not talking about shoving that stuff over in the corner and hiding it so that they don't see it. That's not the design here. The design is that we talk to them in a way that they feel like these are people that actually care about me, that are interested in getting to know me, that people have a genuine interest in me. And it does need to be genuine. Don't put somebody on your contact team that hates people. Let's just, we'll find something else for you to do. That's fine.
Sorry, that's an extrovert job.
Yeah, this is going to sound weird. I am not an extrovert. I'm an introvert, and it's hard for me to talk to people I don't know. Maybe I'm not the guy you bring that person up to immediately and just drop them off. Maybe I'm the person that you kind of include. How you get into that the conversation circle in the back in the foyer, and you kind of gradually open it up a little bit and let somebody in. Maybe that's a deal where the introvert, maybe I get him in when there's 2 or 3 of us talking. I'm not going to put it on him to be the guy to carry the ball for us. It's about, to Terry's point, thinking about who can add value for this person, who can help this person to feel comfortable, who can answer their questions, who can make them think that these are people that are not, I don't say they're not like me, but they have things in common with me. I'm not out of place here. You're trying to make them feel that way. And ultimately, it's so that you can serve them. not so that you can get something from them. And I think that is an important distinction to make.
It was funny in Memphis. I had a guy that visited, and he's an extrovert, and so he visited with us from another congregation. And over time, through our guest evangelism, he and I we kind of grew close. He would call me during the week and ask me questions about. He was checking us out, and he'd ask different questions. And we had 5 elders. Are they all qualified? That kind of questions. And so we had very good conversations. Well, then about a year down the road, maybe a year and a half, he became one of the deacons. He's now an elder there. And one of his jobs was he was put on that same guest evangelism team with me. And so I sat down and I trained him in all that. And he looked at me and goes, so this was all like a thing to get me when I was here. And I was like, absolutely it was. And he's like, that's really smart. Because, I mean, by the way, that's like how every business interaction you have works. Your insurance salesman, the minute you walk in the door, he wants to call you by name. He wants to connect with you. He wants to build a relationship with you because you're more likely to buy more insurance from him if you trust him, if you have a relationship with him. That's how all of this works. We're just doing what everybody else does. And
there's a big distinction there too, that because it's the idea that we're trying to get you. Why? Well, because we want to have 800 people. No, it's because we saw you and said we want you to be a part of this. There's an individual idea that we place value on you specifically when you came in the door, and that has to be the way you approach it, because when that's the way it happens, you don't just get them in there and then just, all right, great, we got him, we're moving on to something else. That's only the first step of the idea of, man, he's now part of our family. Let's integrate him. Let's make sure that we're involved because we want him to succeed spiritually. We want to make sure that he's getting the spiritual food that he needs. It can never be about the numbers, because I think when it is, that's when you have real problems.
Well, because evangelism, and this is something I have to tell people all the time, it's kind of a soapbox. Evangelism is not about numbers. Like early on in my preaching kind of life, I always thought evangelism was about the number of people I got in the baptistry, and that's not it at all. Evangelism is about teaching the good news. And regardless of whether somebody ends up converting or not, as long as you've taught them, you have been successful at evangelism. Successful evangelism is not when somebody agrees enough to submit to what you believe. So successful evangelism is that you shared the truth, period. And that's one of the things you've kind of got to program yourself on all of this. And when you think about, well, how do I reach the established people? They may go somewhere else to church, but if you can get a conversation with them and you can put in them some nugget of truth about the Bible, about the Lord, about serving Him, about what that means, you've been successful in evangelism, whether they ever walk through your door or not. And I think that's also one of the things we got to train our normal pew members to understand. This is not about baptisms. It's not about the numbers. In fact, one of the cool things about where we're at here is we're not meeting in our building, so we repainted the building because all that stuff does matter, by the way. That plays into marketing. We may not get into that too, but maybe. I don't know. We'll see where all that goes. But one of the things we did when we painted the auditorium, number boards are gone. They're gone. We don't post attendance numbers. We don't focus on attendance numbers. Now, the leadership, we look at attendance numbers for a different reason. You might think we're between that 75 and 80% capacity mark, which means that 80% consistently, we got to figure out how we're adding on to the auditorium. So that's why we look at numbers. We look at numbers so we can continue to meet together and we can continue to worship together in a comfortable environment that people will accept. But we don't post numbers and we don't talk about numbers that way because it's not about numbers. That's not what the focus is. And we're so data-driven as a society. We start as a young kid. The first set of data points you get used to as a young kid is what your grades are at school. And your whole life is dictated by those numbers, by the way, as a child, whether you realize it or not. Because Sally got an A and you got a C, and there's all this. And so our whole life ends up, and then in sports, it's who hits better, it's who scores more, our whole life is driven by data. Don't bring that into the church. This is not a data-driven culture. That's not what we should do.
Maybe kind of, there have been a couple comments I want to read to you guys. Where'd they go? They're over here somewhere. Farrell Nicholson said that I'm glad I ran across you guys discussing this. I'm going to immediately start using authentic content. Maybe not scripture all the time, but scriptural and use photos. Thank you so much, you presenters and commenters. And I'd like to echo that. That's a very powerful point. Thank you for bringing that up. Jazz Gray really liked the getting someone people trust to think that you're trustworthy. How you kind of use those relationships to bring people in. Let's see, there was somebody else. Ruth Morris suggested also using, in addition to schools, sports, and churches, to use like civic groups or things similar to that. Maybe clubs like the Rotary Club or other things to kind of establish a presence. And y'all can make comments, respond to those. But one thing I'd like to talk about before we're done is maybe the most difficult established person to reach, the friend, spouse, relative of somebody who has been attending for years, and for whatever reason, they come to worship services, but they just don't show much interest. Interested enough to come, which is certainly something that we shouldn't take away from them. But for some reason, that's all they do. Or maybe the church members who are, again, I'm not trying to pass judgment because you don't know every circumstance in people's lives, but for lack of a better idea, that they just show up to services maybe once a week. And that's like the extent of what they do, which again, I don't want to take away from them because that is something. But how do you engage people like that? What do you do to reach out to them and to bring them in? I like the picture that you're using of bringing people into the family. How do you change them from a member to a family member? Or how do you get that person who's been coming with their spouse for 15 years but just doesn't seem very interested? How do you reach that person? So y'all feel free to respond to those comments or to dive into those. And I expect y'all to answer those, by the way, definitively.
It's great comments. I'm going to say hey to Jazz if she's still listening. She's a friend of mine from Memphis. Jazz is a remarkable person, so love Jazz. Glad she listened to some portion of this rambling. One of the things I've not talked about, and let me say to the difficult person who's attending, kind of that person who thinks they're part of the church but they're not. I mean, that's the best way to describe them, right? That is tough, but it's the same thing. It's relationships. And so you've got to develop trust with that person and relationships with that person in order to have that opportunity. And I do think this is sometimes where the located preacher plays a role, because you're the new guy and he or she is not going to quite trust you. They're going to wonder whether you're going to say something that's going to offend them or you're going to disagree with. And so you got to be very careful to try to build that trust. And that's done the same way it's always done, which is personal interaction. Have them in your home. Spend time with them, not talking about spiritual things. Develop a friendship with them. One of the things I didn't bring up earlier and I meant to is so much of my evangelism marketing connection goes back to, Paul and I didn't talk about this yesterday, but there's a guy named Guy Kawasaki. Paul, have you read any of his stuff? And what he does is called evangelism marketing. And when I tell you what his biggest client ever was, you'll go, oh, which Guy Kawasaki is the guy who basically developed the marketing plan years ago for Apple. And back when, I mean, we're talking before the MacBook, we're talking back when the Apple logo looked like a rainbow apple. Okay. A long time ago, Apple IIe kind of era. Guy Kawasaki came in, and you can Google it. There's 11 points of evangelism marketing. But basically, in a nutshell, it's that you got to believe you have a product that's superior to everything else. And what he really wanted to do was create an environment and a product where everybody who uses those products believes they are superior, and they believe that they can make your life better by convincing you to use that product. So I used to be a PC guy, and then I got into the design stuff, and we'll talk about that more too. and I used Adobe software. Well, if you get into the artistic side of things and design stuff, what you're quickly going to find out is everybody thinks that an Apple is a requirement. It's like this thing. Well, if you're in music or artistic graphic design, you need to use a MacBook. You need to use a Mac. That's part of the culture. And I was told over and over again, dude, you got to use a Mac. You got to use a Mac. And I go, no, I don't need to use a Mac. I don't need to use a Mac. Well, about 5 years ago, I switched to a Mac. And guess what I tell everybody all the time now? You need to use a Mac. I'm one of those guys that I used to hate. Why? Because I believe that I've bought in, I have drank the Kool-Aid. I believe that, for instance, these guys that complain about security issues, I don't have those. I have a Mac. I don't have those security issues that you have with your PC. I don't have viral software. You guys that are downloading all that stuff, I don't have any of that. Why? I have a Mac. You know, the reality is those guys attack the 80% of the computers in the world that use Microsoft Windows. When you get mad about Windows updating your stuff and you can't figure out how to use it, I got a Mac. I don't care about any of that, right? So I'll be that guy on there that says, hey, if you had an Apple, this wouldn't be a problem. You got an Android phone, I'm going to make fun of you because I think iPhones are superior. And I think your life would be better if you used one. All of which is to say, is that an Android? Paul, you're in.
Yes, it is.
All of which is to say, which, by the way, my webcam is an iPhone, which is why I am infinitely clearer than Paul right now. Let's just put that on the record. But all of that is to say, Guy Kawasaki was right. Like, you've got to be convinced that you believe everybody else's life would be better if they had this. So apply that to the gospel. Like, that's the key to all of this. You got to believe that that guy who comes with his wife who's never obeyed the gospel, that his life is infinitely better if you can get him to obey the gospel. Now, the question is, how can I do that? By whatever means are necessary. That's really what happens. You look for every opening to be able, and not in a hateful way. In fact, I'll be honest, I'm probably more hateful about people with Apple products than the gospel because it's really a joke, okay? When it comes to the gospel, I want to build that connection. I want to build that bridge. I want that guy to be my friend. And that may take 4 months. One of the things I've been criticized in the past is, man, this guy's been coming here for 4 months and you and I got him in a Bible study. And I'll say, he's not ready yet. Like, we're not at the point where he trusts me enough to sit down and us have that study. And it may take 4 months. It may take you a year. But you have got to build that trust and that connection that he's willing to listen to you to say, your life is better with Jesus, and let me show you why. And until he believes that you actually have that, not only that you believe it will be better, but you have the ability to show him that, and he trusts you, he's not going to listen to you. So the number one thing to that established guy who thinks he's already a member of the church but isn't is patience on your part. That's the hard part. And patience on everybody else's part. And to take your time to get to know him, to build that connection, that relationship, so it's so strong when you finally have that opportunity. He doesn't want to tell you no to a study because he still wants to be your friend. So one of the things I think we do too often with those guys is we try to launch after them too quickly and too harshly, and we burn those bridges and we never have that opportunity again. So it's the same thing. It just takes a little bit more time and forethought to be able to have the patience to know when the time is right, at least in my experience.
Yeah, and I'll add something to that. And by the way, just so everybody knows, just sticking up for the Androids, my stream has everything to do with my absolutely horrible internet connection. I actually have a very nice webcam, and I'm crystal clear on my end. But however I may look on your end is all about AT&T.
That's a typical PC guy. He thinks he looks great in his own world, but the rest of the world knows.
I do look great in my own world. I'm just looking at here. But anyway, I think there's another thing too, and I struggle with this question as well. And I think a big part of this goes back to the idea that we adopt the behavior that is modeled to us and what is expected of us. And it's true of our kids. It's true of our members. That if I think that I'm a member of this church and I think that I am just like everybody else, I'm fitting right in, it's probably because I am. Because my behavior is just like what everybody else is doing. And this is why, I'm absolutely convinced of this, that we've got so much problem with kids leaving the Lord that don't care about the Lord's church anymore, because what they see modeled from their parents is that their parents don't care. It's not a priority for them. They're not involved. They go there and worship for a couple hours, and we'll go back on Wednesday night, and we make sure we're there for that. But then I go home, and it's no longer a part of my life until I come back. That's not a priority. So if I'm a member of the church and all anybody does is just show up at worship, and maybe we go to a gospel meeting once a year, and there's no behavior beyond that, why do I think that I need to be more involved in that? Now, what happens, I think, or what should happen, is that if the standard of behavior in our community, because that's what it needs to be, it is a community. That's not who we are. We're involved with each other's lives. We are talking about evangelism. We're doing all these other things. And when people come over to my house and I invite members of the church over, and he or she is one of them, what do we talk about? Well, if we're talking about the Bible, and we're talking about God, and we're talking about what that's done in our lives, and that person sitting over here kind of feeling, why is this, all of a sudden it starts to become clear that I'm really not involved in this, because those aren't things that interest me, but it interests everybody else. And I've got two responses to that. I can say, well, these people are weird. I don't care about that. Or maybe there's something to this, and maybe I need to be more involved and getting involved in those discussions. And maybe that motivates me to become more engaged. I don't know that there's any better way to change a culture than one person at a time just buying in and saying, I'm going to be this kind of person. Even if I don't feel like it today, I'm going to be this person. And if we're all doing that, then it's a whole lot easier and more comfortable for people who are on the fringe to start moving in the right direction as opposed to in the wrong direction. And so I think we talk about this idea of creating a culture in our church and in our congregation, and I think that's it. None of this works if you don't have that.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of that's why a lot of times I'm not even sure that having an aggressive membership drive is really even a great idea until you get that internal culture set up and ready to go. That's I think our first job a lot of times.
Yeah, and I plan on talking a little bit about that kind of concept. Paul, you and I talked yesterday. We talk about rebranding at 2:00. One of the things you got to understand is before you can rebrand who the church is, you may have to fix your culture first in order to rebrand it. And we'll talk more about that at 2. Let me say, we talked about relationships and buying in that culture. Let me tell you one thing, and I meant to mention this earlier. I may have glanced over it a little bit. I think in our culture today, especially, one of the greatest ways you get people to build relationships is you actually bring them into your home for a meal. You practice hospitality. That is something that we've gotten away from. When I was growing up in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, back in the 80s, college town, it was very common for my mom to come in on a Sunday morning and say, get your room cleaned up, which meant shove everything underneath the bed because we had a dust ruffle to cover all that stuff. And we're having people over for lunch. And more often than not, we'd be like, well, who's coming over? Don't know yet. Mom would just put a roast on and she would invite people over, whoever, whether it was college kids or maybe it was visitors, whoever it was. And that was a pretty common occurrence at our house. And then I got to tell you that kind of has gone away. I mean, I've heard actually Christians say to me things like, well, I don't like having people in my house because I'm afraid they're going to mess it up. And I think about that and I go, wait a minute, God's blessed you with this gift you could glorify him with, but you want to protect it and bury that talent in the sand is what you really want to do rather than use it. There's nothing more relationship building than somebody bringing you into their house, trusting you to come into their house and spend time together, eating and just being together. Nothing builds a relationship better than that.
And pie.
One of the things
There has
we
to be
do here,
pie.
I'm going to preach on that in the next month, by the way. People will mess it up. I think that's a fantastic idea for a lesson.
one of the things at Chelsea that we have is we have small groups, and we have 5 small groups, and those small groups usually meet Sunday right after church, and we have a meal and whoever's home it is, and then we discuss. I preach one lesson a month. That's our annual theme, and in the bulletin there's questions for the small group leaders to generate discussion based off that lesson. That's how we do our small groups. Well, if you're a visitor and my small group that I'm in charge of is meeting that Sunday, you are going to be invited to come to our small group. Now, you can tell us no, but you're going to come to our small group if you'd like to. And you're going to sit down and you're going to eat with us, and we're going to make sure we have enough food for you. You're not going to have to bring anything. And whoever's home it's in, my small group knows, I don't care whose house it's in that month. I'm inviting that person to come to your house. Okay? And I'm going to tell you what, one time I looked up and there was 35 people in my living room and dining room eating together. One of those families was visiting. They're members now, right? One of the things that helped do that was we developed a relationship, and a large part of that was hospitality. And I used to be that guy that said, hey, just take them out to eat. I will tell you, I am convinced, yes, if that's all you can do, take them out to eat. It is not the same as going into somebody's home. Mm-hmm. Home-based hospitality is huge in the area of evangelism. I walk into your home, you walk into my house, you know about me automatically. One of the first things you're going to see when you walk in my home, besides a big TV over the mantle, because that's just who we are, we have TVs everywhere because we're sports people. But there's a wall of pictures of my family and people that I love. You go downstairs, I live in Alabama, but it is covered in orange because I'm a Tennessee fan. You're going to find that out. When you go through my house, you can have a character sketch of who I am automatically by just walking through my house. People get to know you when you bring them into your house. So I think that's one of the greatest ways you reach established people. Here's this guy who's come with his wife for 10 years. He's never been invited anywhere because he's that guy on the fringe and nobody knows what to say or do with him. Have him over for dinner. And don't say anything about church. Don't go, hey, why aren't you a Christian? Just have him over for dinner. Invite him to your small groups. Try to get involved with him. Have him over a lot. Build that relationship. Then down the road, you have the opportunity to say something about studying. But you got to get to know him first. And so I think hospitality plays a huge part of this.
And this is where, going back to that idea of having a personal brand and the idea, well, but I got to talk to him about the gospel. I've got to tell him. I've got to ask him those questions because otherwise they won't come up. And that's true if there's nothing about me that is showing Jesus. You know, if there's nothing in my life, if there's nothing in my home, there's nothing about the way I talk, the things that I discuss in passing, the way that I behave myself, if those things don't shout to the world that I am a Christian, then that's all I can do is ask those questions. And I think that's kind of where we've got to make sure that we're living life in such a way that there shouldn't be any guessing about how I feel about God. If that person's got a question about God, there is no reason that they should ever feel uncomfortable about bringing that up because they know I love to talk about God. And anybody that brings that up, I'm going to engage it. Their question will be welcomed. I'm not going to look at them like they're weird. I'm not going to say, yeah, but I don't really want to talk about the game, or anything like that. We got to be that kind of people. And I think that's where, to your point, when we don't have to ask those awkward questions, I don't think, or at least we shouldn't have to. Maybe, that doesn't mean that we never, ever bring it up, but it doesn't have to be day 2. Hey, let me talk. I want to talk to you about your soul.
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to leave that discussion. If we get more comments or questions coming in from people, I'll send them to you guys.
Sure.
And y'all can feel free to answer them. There was a couple other things, comments from people that I'd like to bring up before we close out. Perry asked how much of our preaching, and we'll just put teaching in there too, Bible class teaching, preaching, or even maybe work, like talking to somebody in your home. His question specifically is about sermons, but y'all can expand that if you want. How much of our preaching connects everything in the sermon itself back to the gospel and he doesn't mean hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized. The proclamation of Christ. How do you do that? And he wonders if that might be helpful. And so if you all want to talk about that, then we have still a couple other comments that people would like to ask you guys, or questions.
Well, I want every sermon that I teach or preach, every class I teach, to give you something you can do to improve, to be better. And ultimately what that means when in regards to the gospel is I want to show you how in your relationships, in your life, you could be more Christ-like. So if I'm talking about the home, I want to show you how to be a husband who loves his wife like Christ loved the church. Or if I'm talking to wives, how submit to your husband the way you submit to the Lord. I mean, I think all your teaching and preaching needs to come back to some kind of way that we can improve who we are as a disciple. And we try to focus really on the idea of discipleship. We'll talk about that more too, because that's really our brand. Where I'm at is discipleship. And just to be quite honest, if my teaching doesn't bring us back to that at some point, I don't know that it's very valuable for the audience. I might find some, there's some neat stuff that me and my friends preachers talk about, and little intricacies of especially Old Testament stories, and there's some neat ways to look at things. But that doesn't mean I get up and preach about it on Sunday, because it may not really help people walk better as a disciple. And so from that standpoint, I think everything has to come back to that. That's the bottom line, is to help them build their house upon that rock of following, having faith in the Lord.
Amen.
Let's see. Daniel Prince asked, what about, so I think we're going back maybe to Instagram or Facebook, that part of the conversation. And that may be more, y'all may want to talk about this more in that session with the digital media and social media evangelism. But he asked about having members prepare a testimonial to put on social media. Maybe that's in the context, I can't remember when he made that comment. It might have been in the context of getting people who I already trust. Oh, well, you trust this preacher, well, then I'll listen. Have y'all found that to be effective, having testimonies or short videos maybe from people who are members?
I'll answer a couple ways. I don't know that I've found it to be effective, but I think it's a good idea, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Ultimately, people, anytime you have a testimonial, you're putting a name, a face to a story. And there's actually a Facebook thing back up north called People of New York City, and it became very popular. And all it is just this guy going around interviewing people, just talking about who they are and what they're going through and and people like that. I think hearing somebody talk about their experience is something that resonates with people. Now, there's another reason why I think those are important, and this goes back to what we were talking about from a digital standpoint. The more reviews that you have, and you can call them testimonials, that's basically what they are, the more Google gives weight to your listing. So when you see, if you go to Google and you search for your church, and you'll get it, and on the side there, if you've got a business listing, which you better have a business listing if you don't, and a lot of people don't, and they don't realize that is even a thing, but it'll have a place for reviews there. And if people have been there, and we think about those as being something for visitors, but if you're a member there, leave a review, give it 5 stars. It's great, we love it. That's an important thing that helps from the standpoint of search visibility, from credibility standpoint, all of those things. I think you're trying, if people are seeing you in a digital environment, you're trying to get them as much as possible to equate you to an actual real thing. And the more that you can have some tangible connections with that, the more trust that you're going to have, and the more likely that person may be to say, okay, I may go check them out and see what they're about. So yeah, I think they're great ideas to do. how effective are they? I think from a standpoint of going back to what Terry said about preaching the gospel, the idea that it's not about numbers. I don't know that there's a lot of things that you do them just because they're good things to do. And if I don't know that I'll ever get a visitor off of a review, but I'm not sure that's the primary reason to do it.
Yeah, so the testimonial video I think is great for a couple of reasons, but there's also a couple of guidelines. Number one, it needs to be brief, no more than 2 minutes, preferably maybe a minute. It needs to have variety. You don't want every testimonial video to say the same thing. It
No
needs to
hostage
have
videos.
Huh?
No hostage videos.
Yeah. And you want it to be from a variety of demographics. Like if every testimonial video you have is white people over 60, not going to be very effective. And I'm just being honest with you. So you need to ask people of varying ages, kids, no kids, different races, nationalities if you have that, and you use all of those. And that's part of that rotation of different content that's authentic on your Facebook social media pages. I'll add to that. What it does is it also, when you share those, the other benefit is it goes, oh, look, I know that guy. He goes to church there. That's part of why you do that is within the social media. Like you want to connect that in a way that maybe that will come up. You might even boost that more than a sermon, believe it or not, if that's a post on your Facebook page to just your local area. Because that's important. We're doing. Everybody did the collage pictures. We're putting ours together. One of the things we're doing with those collage pictures, though, is we're going to highlight many of those families with different things about them, and we're going to, on a regular basis, introduce. Like, here's the Francis family. They moved to Chelsea 2 years ago. And maybe just a few words about our family. We're going to highlight that if the family's willing on our social media pages. Maybe it's a conversion story. Maybe we're going to generate that, but that's going to do two things. It's going to let people get to know us before they even come here. But it's also, again, that flag of, hey, look, I met Terry at a soccer game. I didn't know he went to church there. Maybe I should go there. And so there's a lot of benefits to that beyond just somebody reading it or watching it as a Google review and that convincing them to go. That's you got to think of these things in a lot of different layers rather than just the kind of understood purpose of those things. You got to look beyond that in that sense.
All right. Do y'all have any?
By the way, that's just one quick thing to add to that, and that is, and it goes back to the question of branding as a congregation. If we have members that are embarrassed to be associated with our group, we have a problem. For whatever reason, and maybe
if we have
with that person,
if we have members who are embarrassed they are associated with us, that goes both ways.
Well, and it goes both ways, yeah. And those are issues that we got to. But at the bottom line, I think that if we ought to have our members and us ought to be excited to talk about the work we're doing, and maybe that's part of that re-education or that conditioning that we talk about, the idea that letting them know, hey, it's okay to be proud about going to worship. It's okay to be proud about working with a group. And that's just as much, it should be a much more important part of your life than that PTA thing that you do, or the book club thing that you tweet about, or your kid's soccer game that you can't shut up about, Terry Francis. But the idea that those are, if we don't see ourselves and what we're doing is that important, and that's what should come through in those testimonials, that people are saying, look, this is who I am. This isn't just a thing that I do. It's just not something that I think is kind of cool. This is a part of thing that is a part of my life, and it defines who I am. And I think those are, if you're doing a testimonial, as much as anything, that needs to be the message that comes out. And we need to be proud to do that, and be willing to put ourselves out there in that regard. If we're kind of trying to do a testimonial that kind of keeps it at arm's length, I'm not one of those crazy religious guys, but it's a good, we have to be careful to make sure if we're going to do it, go do it, and be all in about it.
Along those lines, I'm going to show you this now. This is our brand. We'll talk about that at 2. This is our logo. and this is a stack of stickers. This is that we make available to our members for their cars or for whatever. We had a conversation when we got these about putting this on your car. Don't put this on your car if you drive like an idiot.
Yeah.
Right? Because I don't want somebody associating your bad driving, cutting them off, road rage, whatever it is, with us.
It's called negative brand equity.
Correct. That's the technical term. What it really means is I don't want to be associated with you. Okay. So one of the things, and we'll talk more about that, is there is a responsibility in all of this, that you're an extension of who we are. You're ambassadors for who we are. Act like it. Be the right kind of person. And I think that's a good way to close kind of this out is we talked about how this is about relationships, right? This is all about relationships, about being trustworthy. What does that really mean? You got to be good people. If you're not good people, I don't want to be around you. And we'll talk, it was probably how we'll start off at 2. We've talked about internal culture. There's got to be a serious talk about your internal culture before you can talk about what brand you have. Because if your internal culture is not good, don't brand anything until you get that fixed. So that's kind of a preview of things to come this afternoon.
All right. We'll go ahead and leave it there and pick up right on that point, I guess, when we start talking about rebranding a local church. I'm really excited that you guys are with us today. Thank you very much, Terry and Paul, for being here and sharing your expertise. I learned a lot. I hope other people have learned a lot. And we'll be back at 2 o'clock Central Time if you're watching, the only real time zone. But thank you. Thank
Absolutely.
you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And God bless you guys. And I look forward to talking with you again at 2.